This is the story of United Express Flight 4933. On the 4th of March 2019, an Embraer 145 was flying for United Express, and it was making the flight from Newark to Presque Isle. It was a cold winter stay at Presque Isle, and the snow coated everything. The snow also made it quite hard for landing planes to, land. Information available to the pilots let them know that there was about a quarter inch of snow on the runway, and the airport was trying its best to keep the runways clear of snow. As Flight 4933 approached Presque Isle, the pilot set the plane up to land on runway 01 at Presque Isle. They went over the procedures to land on the runway, and then they tuned the ILS beacon to land on the runway. The ILS would be absolutely essential in landing this plane today, as the ILS, or Instrument Landing System, would take the plane most of the way in towards the runway. Then, once they were close enough to gain a visual lock on the runway, the pilots would take over the Embraer and fly it all the way towards the runway. It's not a complex system, but it gets the job done. With the briefing done, the pilots lined the jet with 31 people on board with runway 01. The first officer was the pilot flying, and at the start of the approach, he had his head down, looking at the instruments. He was making sure that the airplane was where he expected it to be. At this point, they were flying by their instruments. I mean, looking out wouldn't do you much good, as all you could see would be snow and more snow. As the first officer looked up from his instruments to visually find the runway, he just saw a white expanse. He expected to see a thin gray outline of the runway out in front of him, but nope, he just saw the white expanse. The runway that they had been flying towards was not there. The captain, who was the pilot monitoring, saw a small tower out in front of the jet. She immediately called for a go-around. As the pilots pushed the throttles to max power, the jet started to climb away. But I don't know if the pilots realized this at the time, but the plane clipped the lightning rod of the tower as they went around. That was a close call, if anything. As they went around, the first officer asked the captain if she had seen the runway lights on their way down. She said that she did see the lights and added, "It's really white down there. That's the problem." The snow was really making life difficult for the pilots. The captain couldn't understand why they couldn't find the runway. Their instruments had told them that they were lined up with the runway, but for some weird reason, they were not. She came to the conclusion that they must have drifted off to the side as the first officer was transitioning from instrument flying to visual flying. So for attempt number 2, she wanted the first officer to fly by instruments all the way down to the decision altitude. For this approach, the decision altitude was 200 feet above ground level. So, when they were 200 feet off the ground, they had to go around if the pilots did not have the runway in sight. No questions asked. Thus, the pilots set the plane up for approach number 2. The plane latched onto the glide slope and the localizer, the 2 radio beams that would take the plane all the way down to the decision altitude. The captain made sure that the runway lights were at maximum intensity by asking the maintenance workers on the ground. They were, so when they got near the runway, it would be lit up like a Christmas tree. Approach number 2 went flawlessly until they reached the decision height. As they hit 200 feet, the captain said, "Runway in sight, 12 o'clock. The first officer couldn't find the runway. He said, "I'm staying on the flight director because I don't see that yet." The Embraer 145 continued to drop. The pilots searched for the runway in the snowy expanse of Presque Isle, but they could not find it. They were running out of time and they were only 100 feet off the ground. The captain said, "What the expletive?" And the first officer said, "I don't know what I'm seeing." But more importantly, neither pilot called for a go-around. The jet impacted a snow-covered area between runway 01 and the parallel taxiway. The jet slid along the snow-covered ground as it came to a stop. Everyone on board thankfully survived. Looking at the images for this crash, you can see that the main landing gear somehow ended up embedded in the left-hand engine. I, for one, cannot understand how that may have happened. But there was a bigger mystery at play here. How did a jet that was supposed to be lined up with the runway miss it by hundreds of feet? The first thing that they looked at was the pilots themselves. During the second approach, the first officer had heard the captain call out that she had the runway in sight. Thus, when he looked up, he did not see the runway. He probably thought that the captain saw something that he did not. So, after the runway in sight comment, either pilot should have called for a go-around. What's interesting is that the captain saw the tower that they had hit on their first attempt the second time. The thing is, You're not supposed to see a dainty little 30-foot tower on your approach to runway 01 at Presque Isle. This should have warned her that something was seriously wrong as they made the approach to the runway. In addition to that, the captain had fallen victim to confirmation bias. In the briefing for the second approach, she had told her first officer that if they didn't see the runway a second time around, then they just divert to their alternate airport. But as the approach continued, her mind started searching for signs that the plane was indeed lined up with the runway. Her instruments were telling her that she was lined up with the runway, and maybe she saw some lights off in the distance and then assumed that that was the runway. This is a more common phenomenon than you'd think. Years ago, I did a video on AirAsia X Flight 221. That was a perfect example of confirmation bias. You can find the link to that on your screen right now if you want. They then looked into the history of the captain to see why she made the mistakes that she did. The captain used to be a first officer on the de Havilland-8. In her time as first officer, she had received a disciplinary letter and was monitored for 9 months, and she also agreed to not try for captain on the -8. In September of 2017, the captain received a notice of disapproval from the FAA for her Embraer 145 type rating. In addition to all of that, Embraer, the company that actually flew the planes for United Express, put the captain under increased scrutiny due to training failures and a failed proficiency check. Embraer did not correctly identify the shortcomings of the captain. On top of all of this, the first officer was fatigued as he was fighting the flu. But while talking to the first officer, they had noticed something interesting. The first officer had flown into Presque Isle before, and on one of his former flights, he noticed something strange on the approach. The navigational instruments had a pink needle. That pink needle provided guidance from the plane's flight management computer. There was also a green needle, and that needle provided guidance from the instrument landing system's radio beacon. Now, the thing is, if all systems are working correctly, the needles are supposed to more or less line up, but in this case, they were off by a bit. Now, the first officer didn't think much of it at the time. He brought it up with the captain before the flight, but then they both pretty much forgot about it. Like, even after they saw a tower on both approaches, neither pilot put 2 and 2 together and thought that maybe, just maybe, their instruments were faulty. Both pilots gave testimonies that said that the localizer and glide slope needles were centered on the approach into Presque Isle. The pilots were 100% right. In the cockpit, the instruments did show that the plane was on the perfect glide slope for the runway, but testing after the crash showed that the localizer, or the radio beam that governed the lateral movement of the plane, was out of alignment by 200 feet to the right. What that meant was that the instruments in the cockpit would show that the plane was on the correct glide path and that it was right where it should be, but in reality, it would be to the right of the runway by 200 feet. That's why the pilots missed the runway on both occasions. The ILS was misleading them. Now, what was the reason for this misalignment? Well, that was good old-fashioned snow. At the time of the accident, the antenna of the ILS was surrounded by snow that ranged from 2 to 5 feet in depth. That tiny bit of snow messed with the signal, causing the misalignment. They removed the snow and the ILS was working as advertised. The thing is, this was preventable. 36 hours before the crash, another crew of another Embraer flight noted that the ILS was out of alignment. The pilot of the other Embraer flight reported this error to the Boston Air Route Traffic Control Center, who then passed the message along to the FAA's technical operationals personnel, who then informed the National Airspace Systems Operations Manager. Boy, they don't make this easy, do they? Now, as per FAA rules, if you have a suspected navigational aid malfunction, you needed reports from at least 2 aircraft. In this case, there was only 1, so nothing was done. Can you guess which was the first instrument flight aircraft to arrive at Presque Isle after getting the report of the misaligned ILS beacon? Go on into the comments, I'll wait. That's right, it was the accident airplane. The thing is, Presque Isle is a tiny, tiny little airport. I mean, no offense, it looks more like a school than an airport. This meant that they didn't have an air traffic control tower. So, there was no one there that could activate the backup equipment that could have prevented this accident from happening. On top of that, the airport personnel at Presque Isle did not have the necessary instruments to check and diagnose an ILS deviation. Now, it is to be noted that just because a second report was not filed doesn't mean that everything was fine. 5 pilots, including the first officer on the accident flight, had issues with the ILS days before the crash, but none of them filed a report for some weird reason. Why do you think that is? Let me know in the comments below. This accident could have been avoided if someone had reported the misaligned ILS before, or if the snow near the beacons had been removed. But the thing is, this could have been a lot worse. Had it been windy, there would have been a much higher chance that the plane would have flipped over or something. But in the way that it did happen, the passengers just experienced a very hard landing that made their luggage fall out. That landing would have made Ryanair landings look absolutely divine. By the way, if you want to watch that other video, I'll have it on your screen right now for you. Also, if you're curious about ILS deviations, I have another video on Air France Flight 2510. You can watch both videos right now. More mini air crash investigation is always a good thing. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.